and that's the thing. And because of that necessity, I think it's important that we mix, we sit and brainstorm with the private, with the public sector, and see what projects we can deliver fast. Because what we need is to produce projects to make to put the people back to work. So we have to solve the congestion problem, solve the transportation problem, but we have another variable now. What are the projects that are faster on the street? And I think that is what we need. We need to sit together, and that's going to happen in certain states. It's happening right now. I've been called by four different states and another country. I mean, in Canada. And we're studying how to accelerate projects and what projects will be delivered fast.
Well, thanks so much, Governor Northam, Lawrence, and Carlos. Thank you, Governor Hogan, for your leadership of the NGA. And with that, we'll turn it back over to NGA's own Bill McBride. Bill?
Great. Thank you, Governor Ducey, and thank you, Governor Northam, and our two panelists, Lawrence and Carlos, for the great job this afternoon. And before we get to our next panel, I was just informed that on Facebook, we have over 500 people following us on Facebook. So this is just a great showing today, and we appreciate all those people that are. And now we're going to transition into our next panel, and with which will be led by the great governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, and he will be joined and he will introduce the other guests on that panel. So Governor Edwards. Great, and thank you all for waiting for a couple minutes there. So Governor Edwards from Louisiana, you're chairing this panel, so the floor is yours.
My notes show that Bill McBride is going to kick us off. I want to give him, and I think we're about 3 minutes ahead of when we're scheduled to start. So we'll give him an opportunity to come back.
Stand by. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you for bearing with us for a moment. And this next panel is going to be chaired by the great governor of Louisiana, Governor John Bel Edwards. Governor Edwards, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. And we continue to appreciate Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland for his leadership in a very difficult time of the NGA, and particularly his emphasis on infrastructure, which is what we're talking about today. You know, we've been focused so much over the last 3 or 4 months on this public health emergency, this pandemic, that now I think is a really good time to focus on infrastructure. It is a great way to get more workers back to work, stimulate the economy, and I think everybody can agree on that. The challenge is that many states, and certainly here in Louisiana, our revenue has really fallen so much that it's even more challenging today than it was before to deliver infrastructure projects. And that's why I think partnering with the private sector is so important in those areas where we can do that. And I think we've all been pursuing these public-private partnerships for a long time. Now, we're still going to have to do our traditional things, working with the federal government, whether it's the infra grants, which we were just blessed in Louisiana to get a big one down in Lafourche Parish to allow us to elevate Highway 1, which that services the port that in turn services most of the deep well activity in the Gulf of Mexico. But we're also going to have to look at all of the other funding mechanisms that are available to us. And we know that P3s are not all the same, and not all projects are the same. So they have to be specifically designed and tailored so that they work. We're not where Virginia is. I know that Governor Northam said a while ago they've been doing these for 30 years and they've got $11 billion. But the good news is Louisiana finally is pursuing its very first, and not just pursuing, we're actually implementing the very first public-private partnership on a bridge down in Plaquemines Parish. But I know that we're blessed to have a couple of other wonderful governors with us today on this panel. I'm going to first go to Governor Bullock, and then whenever he finishes with some opening remarks, we're going to go to his neighbor to the south, Governor Mark Gordon from Wyoming. But the governor of the great state of Montana, Steve Bullock, if you would share some thoughts with us this morning.
Thanks, Governor Edwards. It's great to see this panel, at least virtually. Certainly not the summer meeting any of us wanted to have, but again, underscoring what Governor Edwards said, that I think that I applaud Governor Hogan for making his chair's initiative about infrastructure. I mean, there's no doubt that infrastructure investments play a critical role in sustaining economic growth, creating good jobs, good paying jobs in our communities. But at this time, these investments are all that much more important during a time when our country is really facing an ailing economy from a global pandemic. And I think we all knew as governors the importance of infrastructure investments and partnerships prior to this. Just really does substantially underscore it, as we've also been the frontline managers of a global pandemic. You know, fortunately, my last legislative session as governor, because I'm wrapping up, coming close to the end of my term, we were able to receive bipartisan support on a comprehensive infrastructure package. And I signed into law Montana's single largest state infrastructure investment to date. But it wasn't easy work. And we had to break a logjam. For many years, legislators were unable to agree how to pay for essential infrastructure, much needed projects to build bridges, to ensure clean water wasn't further delayed. Because in some cases, those delays were well over a decade. With the means to finally fund long overdue infrastructure projects, we're moving forward, putting shovels to dirt on water, sewer, bridges, buildings, and other public works projects across our state. And I think it's important to recognize what this does. As an example, in April, we successfully sold just one of the tranches of bonds, certainly at a historically low interest rate, but on a bond sale of just $33 million, It's anticipated that we'll be creating 400 jobs and also supporting $20 million in wages. So these investments not only make sense for the long term, but on the short term, they actually pay back in good paying jobs and wages along the way. And the projects will be critically important to boosting our economy in our state. As leaders, we have to ensure that we're making sustained investments in infrastructure, especially at a time when it's needed perhaps now more than ever. It often requires innovation and working together at all levels of government and with the private market. And as I think we'll hear throughout the panel, there are different opportunities and challenges when we talk about public-private partnerships across our country. In Montana, at times, actually, our legislature has been a barrier to allowing projects to move forward in partnership with the private side. But our Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, as an example, has a renewable resource development loan program. Program provides provides financial assistance for construction of water resources, such as drinking water or irrigation systems, and low interest rate. And through the public-private partnerships, we're able to make the investments that protect Montana's waters and keep our communities strong. We're also seeing some interest from private investments to support our efforts, as an example, in providing safe wildlife passages through permeable transportation infrastructure. At the end of the day, I'm certainly pleased that in Montana, we finally broke that log jam of making investments in infrastructure. As we move forward, it's so important that we continue to keep infrastructure at the forefront of the discussion, both for the short term and long-term economic recovery, and in protecting the long-term vitality of our states. This will require continued leadership, partnerships, and innovation, but in doing so, we can really create good jobs and foster a strong economy for the citizens of all of our states. So thanks so much for including me, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Steve. And now we'll go to your neighbor, Governor Gordon.
Oh, well, thank you, Governor John Bell Edwards. Again, thank you for your leadership in these tough times. Certainly you experienced it sooner than either Steve or I did. Steve, it's good to see you. And you know, it's always nice to hear what's going on upstairs, so to speak. You know, I just want to reiterate some of the points you made. Earlier, I made a comment about, you know, Wyoming's economy being really largely about energy and the infrastructure that's associated with that. In our own experience a few years ago, using essentially a bonding authority at the state, we were able to get a couple of pipelines built, that both to the Midwest and then out to the West Coast for natural gas that's produced here under incredibly stringent environmental standards, making sure that our labor standards are well protected, and really doing a good job with producing a domestic resource. We've also partnered in a similar thing to what Governor Bullock was talking about. We have the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, which has helped to put up wildlife passages over roadways and build new irrigation infrastructure, revamp it in a way that allows for the historic passage of sturgeon up the Powder River and many of the other kinds of things that have really allowed wildlife to become a very large part of what makes Wyoming attractive. And when I think about that, I think, of course, about tourism and how important tourism is to our part of the country, the Northern Rocky Mountains, and then the infrastructure that's associated with things like airports, things like roads, to make sure that we can get products across the country. Things like our railroads. Now, there's an interesting issue because our railroads are starting to, become much more difficult to maintain. Just recently, we had an accident in Rock Springs, largely just because it's aging infrastructure. And when you think about our towns and our counties, Wyoming's lucky to have what we call our mineral royalty grants, where we can partner with our towns to be able to fix infrastructure. In some cases, our towns have sewer infrastructure built on clay pipe that goes back to the 1930s and starts to, collapse unexpectedly. We've been able to work with communities and others to try to figure out ways to address those needs. Roads, bridges, all of those things are important. And so Wyoming really has engaged across a broad spectrum of efforts. And I think really what I'd like to leave you with is an experience that happened in Wyoming last year. Of course, during the early 1920s and 30s, there was an enormous effort you all are aware of to build out the United States. Big dams were built and large irrigation structures that go to feed our country. And last year, some of that started to fail in catastrophic ways. It took 110,000 acres of production offline when a tunnel collapsed in Wyoming last year. That 110,000 acres of barley, wheat, sugar, beets, and other soybeans, et cetera, all of that 110,000 acres was in Wyoming and Nebraska, and really partnering with Governor Ricketts of Nebraska and ourselves, we were able to get a temporary fix in place, but it pointed out just how vulnerable our nation is. And it couldn't come at a more important time. As I mentioned before, what an inflection point for our country to understand our supply lines are weak, our logistics need to be fixed. We need to make sure that we can produce domestically those things that we need to have, and we need to be able to have access to international ports for our overall economy. What an exciting time to be alive.
Thank you, Mark. And we're gonna transition now into our experts. The three governors, we're not experts, but we do have two really good ones with us today. David Agnew is the managing director at Macquarie Group. He's responsible for federal, state, and local government relations in the infrastructure and real assets group there. We also have Tom Osborne, who's the executive director of the infrastructure team at IFM Investors. That's an international investment firm representing institutional investors. And Tom, we're going to start with you. When we talk about P3s, people often think of roads. And quite frankly, that's what I think of most often, roads and bridges. But there are many other applications for different types of projects and different types of partnerships. And I would just ask you to explain how these partnerships differ and how can states go about leveraging more private sector investment. And you have three governors on the panel, all from rural states. And so when I listen to Governor Northam talk about Virginia and Interstate 66, that's not an opportunity we have here in Louisiana because we don't have the vehicle miles traveled, the population density. But if you could, how can rural states do a better job of accessing private capital through these partnerships?
That's a great question. I really appreciate the opportunity, Governor Edwards, Governor Gordon, Governor Bullock, to share thoughts with you today on infrastructure investment. These are vitally important issues, and the rural question is key among them. Just by way of background, we come at this with about 20 years of experience in investing in infrastructure directly on behalf of retirement savers globally. And there was a question or a comment earlier by Governor Northam about how to create long-term stable partnerships with the private sector. We'd like to think that investing in the retirement savers of workers globally is a great way to help underpin that long-term stability of those partnerships with the private sector. To answer your question directly, there are multiple types of projects that are of great interest to the private sector, whether it's greenfield development or brownfield operational infrastructure. There's multiple infrastructure subsectors of interest. You pointed out roads. There's also ports and airports and water systems and broadband. And each of those has very specific considerations that need to be taken into account. But to get the best bang for the buck in leveraging the private sector investment, there are a few fundamental principles that are always going to apply, and I just want to go through those. As you think about this, very clearly, you're going to want to focus on your objectives and be very clear about those, giving careful consideration to the specific investments that are going to improve the lives of your constituents, whether it's shortening their commutes, or cleaning up their drinking water, or improving their access to broadband, their access to education through broadband. When you think of public-private partnerships, think first and foremost about partnerships. The private sector is here to help you, and we can help you in very important ways, like shedding risk or introducing innovation and efficiencies. By partnering with investors, you can position yourselves better to achieve your objectives than would otherwise be the case. There are experts out there that can help you to negotiate the right deals, deals that are tailored to meet your very specific needs. And finally, you're going to want to craft your message very, very carefully. What's worked elsewhere around the world, including Australia, where we have extensive experience, is when the governors can be very persuasive in communicating the benefits that they're going to deliver in terms of better service, safety and reliability, and making clear that you're going to protect the public interest through properly structured agreements with the private sector. In my experience, it's that winning of the public trust that's really essential to delivering a successful outcome. And I would say lastly, as you think about the steps that you can take today to improve your access to public-private partnerships, look to programs that have proven successful in other jurisdictions. I mentioned in one of the earlier discussions we had today about the challenges that we face in America, the huge shortfalls in state and local budgets, high unemployment, the crumbling infrastructure, the ultra low returns that pension savers are able to achieve in the current low interest rate environment. So we would propose that the governors and their municipal counterparts help address all four of those issues with a single solution. Here's how. Lease a few of your existing public assets and use those proceeds to invest in other infrastructure. Doing this can help you to generate new revenues, to create jobs, to boost investment, to drive economic growth, and to improve the retirement outcomes for millions of workers. And I would say, to make it easier for you all to achieve that, consider backing federal legislation that has been written and is currently pending in the Senate. Consider that federal legislation for a pilot program of incentive grants that state and local governments can qualify for by leasing existing infrastructure assets like airports and water systems, and using the proceeds to invest in other infrastructure. These federal incentive grants are a proven method for catalyzing growth and attracting investment, and they also provide crucial political courage to state and local governments to explore alternatives to traditional public procurement and municipal borrowing. We know programs like this are effective because we've seen them succeed elsewhere. In Australia, for every dollar of federal grant offered, over $6.50 of economic infrastructure investment was generated. Also, the program caused investment to accelerate. Taxpayers got better service quality, and this was all in all a low-cost, high-impact program that we think we can successfully replicate here in the U.S. with your help. We have a number of successful examples of infrastructure leases in the U.S. When we acquired the Indiana toll road several years ago, we invested more into that road than at any time since its original construction in the 1950s, improving the road service and the signage and completely overhauling the rest stops. And as a result, the safety metrics have improved, as has the user experience. In the meantime, the state of Indiana, importantly, was able to cover more than 10 years of highway investment with the proceeds from the lease concession. And that was very clearly the objective of the governor at the time of that lease. Later, governor was able to generate even more proceeds for investment in transportation and rural broadband by modifying the concession terms. So we want to help you to generate more success stories like this, but to do so your Washington delegations need to hear from you that you want and need a federal program of infrastructure investment incentive grants, a program that will cost very little at the federal level, but can have a really outsized impact in helping you to raise new revenues and create jobs at a time when both are currently urgently needed. Happy to share additional information at your convenience.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And David, I'll pose the same question to you if you don't mind.
Sure. Thank you so much, Governor Edwards. It's great to be with you and Governor Gordon, and it's always nice to see my friend, Governor Steve Bullock. I also just want to thank Governor Hogan for his chair's initiative. I think this initiative has done an excellent job of highlighting the way the private sector and states can work together to address our infrastructure needs. I'm proud to be here today representing Macquarie. We're one of the world's largest infrastructure advisors and asset managers. We have over 372 billion currently under management, and over 136 billion of that is invested directly in infrastructure through MIRA, which is our infrastructure and real assets division. And we help finance, build, and operate infrastructure all around the world and provide daily services to over 100 million people. And Governor, as you know, we're proud to operate the Central Louisiana Electric Company, CLECO, among other investments, and we thank you for your support of CLECO and Macquarie through the years. To your question, Governor, I would double down on what Tom said, first of all. I think this idea of states and cities leasing major infrastructure assets and then plowing that money back into new infrastructure is really an idea that has succeeded around the world. And it's tougher here in the United States for a lot of reasons. But I think that states and cities should consider that type of transaction, and also believe that the federal government should be encouraging that type of process. You know, the truth is, as we said on earlier panels, the private sector is already so invested and so engaged in providing infrastructure. But I think the truth is that in the United States, there's also sort of a ceiling, and the private sector isn't as involved as it is around the rest of the world. I think it happens too often as an exception, and its private sector involvement is viewed as a sort of a risky innovation that requires special rules and a really politically difficult process. And what I would encourage governors to consider and states to consider is just at this point taking a few specific actions that might help change that paradigm. First, I would encourage states to make sure they have a clear understanding of their assets and what those assets might be worth on the open market. Might even consider getting your major cities to go through that type of exercise, because I think publicizing that information in and of itself would prompt some interesting, creative, and potentially lucrative proposals to states and cities. Second, I would urge you to consider setting up some new procurement structures. There are great examples of P3 offices like the one that Virginia had, offices of innovation, creative infrastructure partnerships all across the country and also in foreign countries. And I think these structures can become a very important locus of expertise in your state as you consider more innovative techniques for delivering infrastructure. Third, I would say on any big complex infrastructure project, as you are now in Louisiana, make it a point, perhaps even a requirement, as some Canadian provinces do, to consider a public-private partnership as an option for delivering that infrastructure. I think the competition that comes from that decision alone would pay huge benefits. And so across the board, I think there are huge opportunities. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital that very much want to be investing in U.S. infrastructure. And we just need to stay focused on how to remove some of those procedural and procurement barriers that keep it from happening in a manner that it does around the world.
Thank you, David. As you can see, I've been taking notes here while you and Tom were speaking, and I actually have my Secretary of Transportation here with me today as well, learning from you all. We're going to bring the governors back in, and this is actually going to be a question for all of you to answer. And I've been asked to ask you to limit your answer to 30 seconds. Well, I don't think we can do that very well, but I think we've got a couple of extra minutes too. So you don't feel compelled to stick exactly with 30 seconds. But Governor Ducey asked this question a while ago as well. Specifically, how should states approach public-private partnerships for infrastructure? And what we'll do is we'll start with Governor Bullock and go through Governor Gordon, and then back to Tom and David, and then I'll come back and wrap up in just a moment.
Sounds great. And thanks, Governor Edwards. And thanks, Tom and David, because I think that sort of part of what you provided really underscores how states should. That, you know, I've said that a toll road across I-90 in Montana just isn't going to work, right? That at the end of the day, from a population, especially in rural areas, we have to be thinking far beyond just sort of what the traditional, as Governor Edwards said at the start, far too often when we're thinking of public-private partnerships, we're just thinking of roads and bridges. But we as a country need to be thinking, just like a water and sewer system or a road is essential for a local community. At this point, connectivity is equally important to have a thriving community. And that's another thing that we really saw through this COVID-19 pandemic as well. So to be creatively thinking about the ways that we can bring in the private sector, and at times the state being that true partner and even bringing dollars up, if that's what's going to, at the end of the day, lead to the services for our states. The notion of that, just like the private sector can't do it alone, states can't do it alone either. And there ought to be federal assistance along the way when we look at the comprehensive infrastructure needs across. When we look at infrastructure, look, the most antiquated piece of machinery throughout the West, as an example, is probably the electric grid. And private industry shouldn't have to do that alone. The states have never really come together, but we could actually have a meaningful private partner or private public partnership. When I first got elected, you know, I was talking to a number of CEOs and say, like, what's the best advice that they could give me? One I'll never forget said that don't ever underestimate the power of a governor's phone call. Meaning that we as governors have incredible opportunity to convene the right people around the table. And I look at when, you know, 3 different legislative sessions, a bill through our state legislature, and it's Republican-controlled legislature, that dealt with public-private partnerships, never quite made it across the finish line. Part of it is that we need to do the work up front to get the right people around the table. And often that's industry, that's local government, that can be organized labor. So we can all see the way that this can be a win, not just for state revenues, but for local communities and good paying jobs along the way. So again, really appreciate both the good work that Governor Hogan has done, but also the good work of folks like you and Tom and you, David, in helping governors see all the different opportunities there are when we're all sharing sort of the same interests, and that's getting the good jobs built, doing the work today that is important, not just for today, but to set our states up for the long term as well. So thanks so much for including me in this panel.
Thank you, Steve. Mark?
Well, yeah, thank you, Governor Edwards. And following up on Steve's comments a little bit, I noticed the backgrounds each of you seems to be in New York and maybe Chicago. And there's a lot of buildings and a lot of people. And as Governor Bullock really referred to, you know, a small state, we're the smallest in the country population-wise. You know, it makes it particularly challenging to find opportunities like toll roads. And it's always interesting to tell pensioners that we're going to build a toll road so you can pay more for your road access. So I think Governor Bullock's got a very good point there. On the other hand, though, you know, we're facing really across the West the opportunity to electrify transportation. We'll need charging stations across large expanses of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. You know, and I think perhaps there's a real opportunity to partner there. And so if we were looking at that, I guess the question I would sort of run back to David and Tom is how should we approach that kind of a thing? It's going to take a multi-state approach. and it's going to take really some opportunity to work. And I think Western governors are unique in their capacity to work across the aisle and try to figure out a way to build the entire country.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Tom?
Well, thank you again, Governor. Appreciate the opportunity to respond to these excellent questions that have been raised. Governor Gordon, as a native of the state of Colorado, I certainly understand the Western perspective that you just spoke about. And Governor Bullock, I very much appreciate your comment about the power that a governor has in making a phone call and convening the right folks. So those are two things that I would like to highlight. In terms of the rural versus urban question, it's critically important, particularly as you think about your interaction with the federal government, to figure out how best that rural states can come together. And one of the things that we've proposed in the type of legislation for federal investment incentive grants in infrastructure would be that rural states would benefit from a higher share of the program than urban states. In other words, when rural states choose to lease existing infrastructure assets and use those proceeds to invest in other infrastructure, that their grant from the federal government as a proportion of the proceeds that they got from the lease would be higher than would be the case for an urban applicant for the program. Also, we think it's critically important that states within their own states, but also across state lines where it's relevant, come together to bundle assets. I think the electric grid is an interesting example that you've mentioned. Earlier today, there was mention of a program of bundling bridges across states to form a public-private partnership that was of sufficient critical mass to attract private sector investment. So bundling, I think, is a really key concept that can work to meet your needs and both to attract the private sector investment also.
Thank you, Tom. And by the way, I want to thank all of you. I think your presentations have been excellent, and I've been taking notes here. I have personally learned a lot, and I think we have some real opportunities, and it's never been more important or more urgent that we take advantage of opportunities than right now in the situation that we all find ourselves in. So I want to thank you for the ability to learn from you all, for your willingness to share your perspectives and your experience with everybody. And so at this point in time, we're going to conclude this session, and I'm going to turn it back over to—
Oh, what about David?
Oh.
Beg pardon?
You forgot David Agnew.
And
Are you afraid he's going to lean back and fall
David,
right into the city?
I'm sorry.
David,
You do get 30 seconds though, David, because we're
30 seconds.
here.
Thank you, Governor Bullock. I appreciate that.
He's got your back. Just don't lean back. I worry about you there.
Dave.
I'll just second that idea that when governors convene, big things can happen. And if you convene a group of citizens, whether at your state or your region as the West, and set that vision for what needs to be achieved in infrastructure, then just figure out the proper delivery mechanism, whether it's traditional public procurement or figure out whether or not private sector capital can play a role. I think if you set that vision and then view all these different sources of delivery as possibilities, bigger things will happen for U.S. infrastructure. And we just encourage you to make sure that when you do that, private capital is considered not an innovation or something to do if somebody thinks it's a fine idea. I think it should be considered as a tool in the toolbox every single time. So thank you, governors.
Thank you very much. And so now I'll just ask you to remember what I said just a couple of minutes ago, and we're gonna wrap up. But thank you all very, very much. And I want to pass it back to Bill at the NGA.
Great. Thank you, Governor Edwards, for taking the time to moderate this panel today. And thank you, Governor Bullock and Governor Gordon, for joining us today. And of course, to our friends Tom and David and all the other advisory council members who have provided such strong support in the last year for this very important initiative. And so it was a great session today, and we really appreciate it. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to our chair, Governor Larry Hogan, to close things out today. Governor Hogan?
Thank you very much, Bill. And first of all, I just want to thank Governor Ducey for hosting us virtually in Phoenix today. I want to thank all my fellow governors who did such a great job leading our panels, and thank you for joining us. I want to thank our partners, our guests who participated in the panels were terrific, but all the members of our advisory council and our partners in this initiative. I think this was another really productive and informative summit. I think we've all learned a great deal, and I'm very excited to be able to share some of this input with all of America's governors and with our federal partners. And as we wrap this up, this summit, our infrastructure initiative continues. And I welcome all of you to join us next at our virtual summer meeting in August, which will be hosted by Maine Governor Janet Mills, where I'll be wrapping up my initiative and my very eventful term as chairman of the National Governors Association. I'll be passing the gavel to my vice chairman, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and his new vice chair, Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to talking with you on the next call in August. Thank you.